Welcome back. So this is a section where we are going to ask you to really just answer a simple question. And that question is, what opportunities do you see in the insurance sectors across the continent of Africa? And really what you're going to do is pick a sector, write up your views, what's the opportunity that you see, how do you think you can take advantage of that in maybe 300 words or less. Post that on Aspire, and you'll also comment on other students' work. But before we get into that, I think what's really important is to try and understand when we say there's an opportunity, what is like a starting point? And through the innovation process, we'll look at this in many, many different ways. But for the purposes of this question, really what I want to do is I want to talk about the addressable market size. So what is the actual size of the opportunity that we're pursuing? Now, in my line of work, I spend a lot of time looking at opportunities and being presented with opportunities where often the market size is massively overstated. And really this is because we have a real data problem, especially when it comes to sizing markets on the continent. Now, as I would have mentioned before, South Africa is a pretty unique space. It's a very small market. It's a country of 50 million people, but that does not mean there are 50 million customers. Even if we're talking about a mass market product or an FMCG product like Coke, the mass market for Coke is only ever going to be 50% of the size of the total market, which puts the total market size for Coke in South Africa at 25 million people, which is pretty big. However, if you're dealing with a more niche product, if you're selling upmarket cars or clothing, that market goes from being 50 million, in some cases, all the way down to 10, 12, 13, 14, 50,000 people. So market sizing is a real challenge because we don't have sufficient accurate data on the markets in the continent, and therefore we typically read articles or we see a publication or we hear about something and then we take that fact as gospel, when in fact that fact may not be correct in the first place. So, give you an example of where this has gone horribly wrong in the past. So a number of years ago, this is around 2010, there were some statistics that came out that said there were 300 million people in the African middle class. Now that is a very large number of people to have in a middle class in any part of the world, specifically when there's only 350 million people in the middle class in North America. So how do we go from being the poorest continent on the planet to rivaling North America for, in the middle class? Well, the point is we didn't. And it's important that we take an underlying view of the actual data. So consider this, you have the good people of the world collecting for the poor starving children of Africa earning less than $2 a day. This is in Belfast, just up the road from where I was born. Or equally so, you have at the exact same time people celebrating the size of the African middle class, popping bottles of champagne in the air-conditioned offices of Singapore's and the boardrooms of London. And the reality is that there was a lot of bias that crept into this data point. And the timing of this was quite important. So what happened was around 2008, 2009, we had a global recession. And companies were really looking where could they start to carve out new growth, because a lot of their existing growth had been eroded in some of their main markets. Now what had happened was they had looked to other parts of the world that they didn't really understand for that particular growth. And there was an article that got published in the New York Times. It was picked up in the Washington Post. It was circulated in The Economist. And all of a sudden, all over the world, there's this really big news story saying there's a massive market in sub-Saharan Africa that we've really never seen before that says there's 300 million people there. Now, as someone who's traveled that part of the world on quite a frequent basis, I was quite surprised when I saw this. So I wrote about it, I published a paper on it, and that paper was not well received because what I had said was there is no chance that market is as big as we think. Subsequently, a number of companies set up shop and certainly expanded their operations across the continent, only to find out there were not 300 million people in the middle class. So what happened? So what happened was the World Bank, in partnership with one of the large consulting firms, did a study. And what they did in that study is they changed the baseline numbers. So if you're sitting in Europe and you're earning less than $20 a day, you're considered to be below the poverty line. But if you're in Africa and you're earning more than $2 a day, you were considered to be in the middle class. Now, in any stretch of the imagination, $2 a day does not put you in the middle class. But this was the statistic, or so to say, the data point that was unexamined through this whole process. So you had a very, very strange situation where companies that really fundamentally didn't understand the African market, but had seen this article published far and wide, picked up by really respectable newspapers and magazines. So they took that as gospel. Now, in reality, if you were to kind of think about this slightly differently, and you were to apply that European standard of roughly $20 a day, you would see there's about 100 million people in the middle class in Africa, which is not terribly bad, but that is spread over a very large geographical area over approximately 52 countries. So it's very, very dispersed. It does present a lot of opportunity, but it is nowhere near as significant as the size and income potential of a middle class of 300 million people earning, on average, a median, say, figure of $50 a day. And one of the challenges we have with this is we don't triangulate our data. So one of the concepts we talk about a lot in design at the moment and in innovation is this idea of triangulation of dynamic data. So what do you mean by triangulation? We mean having at least 3 different data points that you can validate your story with. So in the case of the 300 million people in the African middle class, there was in fact only one data point. And that data point was an inaccurate data point. But everybody was referencing and quoting the same data point, which creates a big challenge when you're trying to really validate the size of a market. And one of the challenges we have in South Africa and across the continent is we don't have enough independent sources of data to triangulate our data. So we therefore rely on third-party articles as opposed to first-party exposure to what's actually going on. And to a certain extent, this is understandable. If you're a business executive and you're kind of traveling in different parts of the world, typically you see the inside of an airplane, the inside of a hotel room, and the inside of a boardroom. You don't really get to experience the market on the ground. And the markets on the ground are often very different from how they're stated in an actual news article. So a good case in point in this is a number of years ago, the same week Nigeria came out and said it had the largest GDP on the continent purely because it had rebased its GDP, and quite accurately it was the largest economy at that time. Woolworths pulled out of Nigeria. Now, if you look at that press release that Woolworths put out, it was this very well crafted piece of copy that said, well, there's some distribution challenges, there's some logistics issues, we're not going to trade in this market any longer. At the same time that it announced itself as the actual largest market in the continent, on the continent. So Nigeria is a country of approximately 180 million people. So they'd obviously seen this. They said, well, there's obviously a market there for us. But if you spend time in that market and you understand how it functions, and actually what Woolworths were doing there was not selling fresh fruit, vegetables, and product. They were selling clothing. And really the market and the middle class market in Nigeria, in the main cities of kind of Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, Kaduna, is a much, much smaller market. It's about 200,000 people. And that market is really insufficient to support a large brand that's trying to sell upmarket clothing to the middle class. But what's more is really Nigerians didn't actually resonate with Woolworths. In fact, I was in Lagos at the time when this happened, and I spoke to some of my Nigerian colleagues, and they were like, look, Terry, we just don't aspire to buying a middle-class South African brand. They would rather spend the same amount of money on a second-hand pair of Levi jeans because it's got a more associated badge value. So not only is understanding the actual market size really critically important, understanding if your customer resonates with you in that market is equally important. Which brings us on to the next point, which is around, even though we think we might have an innovative idea or opportunity, we often misidentify the opportunity space. So let me explain what I mean by that. If we look at opportunity, typically that is something that is either an improvement on the status quo or an existing product. Maybe it's a redesign of that product. Maybe it's a fresh idea, or maybe it's actually a systemic change. Now, where innovation really occurs is in the top right-hand quadrant. It's where it's a fresh idea and it is a systemic change. If you are simply innovating a product or marginally, incrementally changing that product, that is not really radical innovation or innovation at all. That's just ongoing pivoting of that particular product on an ongoing basis. So really where innovation occurs is in the sort of new idea systemic change space. When we talk about systemic change, we'll talk about things like Uber, we'll talk about things like Airbnb. Back in the day, a company like OutSurance would have been a new idea, a direct-to-market product where there was none before, or certainly not ones operating in the same way. So when we look at innovation across the board and we look at it specifically in your sector, we often look to the global goals, the sort of sustainability development goals for inspiration, because there's a lot of opportunity covering across these kind of various areas, and they are worth exploring. So if we look at the particular task that you have for the remainder of this section, is really what we want you to do is just look at what opportunities do you see in the insurance sector across the continent, given some of the context we spoke around innovation, around market sizing, and so on and so forth. And then I want you to actually pick a sector, pick an opportunity, write it up in 300 words, and then publish that on the discussion board. And then please also comment on at least 2 or 3 other people's work as well.